For the past 40 years, the people of Spalding, a small town in eastern England, have been fashioning a spectacular event out of a local industrial waste product. This part of the county of Lincolnshire is known as Holland because of its similarity to the neighbouring country across the North Sea. Not only would the landscape be familiar to a Dutchman, the flowers would also remind him of home, because the locals share his enthusiasm for tulips, daffodils and other bulb-grown blooms. For more than a century, flowers have been picked here in the spring from local fields and glasshouses. Bunches of unsorted flowers are taken from the fields to the packing sheds. Here they're sorted for colour, size and bloom development, ready for dispatch to customers. To protect the delicate product during its journey, it's packed with care into whatever seems the most appropriate cartons. These workers in the 1930s are using wooden boxes, but card, fibreboard and plastic have all been used at different times. The blooms are sent off to the customer or the market as quickly as possible. Despite appearances, this truck was high technology for its day. Flower production and packing was, and is, a very labour-intensive business, generating a good appetite, if the enthusiasm of these workers heading off for a meal break is anything to go by. The flower, though, was only half the product. A major part of the growers' income comes from producing bulbs for home gardeners, local authorities, and anyone else hoping for the great gaudy slabs of colour that only bulbs can provide to brighten up the early spring. The bulbs are ploughed out, still using horses here in the 1940s, and picked, ready for cleaning and packing. It's a job that needs a lot of attention and handwork, with one job that's unique to bulb production. The plant has to be knobbed, the flower head removed to encourage it to put all its resources into growing a better bulb, rather than developing a seed head. The heads used to be one of the world's most colourful wastes, carted off the fields and dumped. Before the parade started, there had been efforts to use the flowers as a tourist attraction. Routes were marked out on local roads to guide visitors to the most spectacular fields of flowers. And local growers, with the town of Spalding, sponsored Tulip Time.
Well, my memories actually go back before the flower parade, when, as a member of the Young Farmers Club at Spalding, we put on an exhibition for visitors to Spalding Tulip Time. And we charged them 3 pence to enter.
Tulip Time was a successful initiative, but it needed something else to really get the ball rolling. Another local grower remembers playing a key part after taking a look at what his colleagues were doing across the North Sea.
40 years ago is a long time now, but I was chairman of the decorations committee of the old Tulip Time committee, and I wasn't very happy how things were going in England compared with the Dutch parade. And I went over to Holland and saw the Dutch parade, and on return I thought, well, we must do something better than this for England. So I went to see the late Leonard Van Geest, and he said, well, we ought to do something. So he said, I'll let you have a lorry and I'll get Adriana Spandriel to come over and we'll see what we can do. So we got this lorry and we decorated it up, and a couple of cars, and we got the Tulip Queen on the lorry, and that also showed what could be done. And so after that I was a member of the NFU Horticultural Subcommittee, and I managed to persuade them to take this on for the following year, and we managed to get 6 floats in and a few vans, and really that's how the whole thing started.
And from that small start developed the modern Spalding Flower Parade. The 1959 event may not look much compared to later extravaganzas, but all the basic ideas were in place for the future. A tulip queen in her own carriage, colourful floats dressed out with flower heads, unusual or decorated vehicles, and promotions for local and national companies. There was just one problem. How was the whole thing to be financed?
Everything had to be done voluntary those days, and I know Van Driel, he was a real enthusiast, and he went round amongst everyone and saying, oh, you know, you mustn't be so serious, you must enjoy yourselves and have a bit of time off and enjoy the flowers and beauty and that sort of thing. And he managed to convince enough people to enter the floats and decorate them. That's how it all started, really.
Fortunately for Spalding and the parade, the enthusiasm was contagious, and the first full flower parade took to the streets, where it got an enthusiastic reception. The following year's parade was bigger than its predecessor, but it was still very largely a local event, both in terms of the audience and the companies who supported it.
Spalding Bell Company, J.T. White, Smedley's, all those sort of people put the early floats in, and the villages, Pinchwick West put a float in, and several more. Machins were good supporters those days. It was all voluntary. There was virtually little expense incurred.
1960 also saw the start of the involvement of one of the people who's been a part of the parade ever since.
One of my customers were mail order bulb firm, and thought they would rather like a float, and as a regular customer they came to me to build it, and I built one other that year. Gradually over the years it increased on 3 or 5 in the third year, and then I should think after 6 or 7 years I was building 80% of the parade, and then for the last 30 years I've done the lot.
As the parade developed, its fame began to spread. Coach operators and the railways added Spalding in springtime to their excursion itineraries. Organisations like the Potato Marketing Board, with local connections and a national brief, were joined by national companies. If one parade is good, think what two can do. Spalding-based geese, famous for their fruit and other fresh produce, were keen to make a mark on an event with a national audience. But a year later, it was still possible to watch a local hairdresser boasting a giant pair of floral scissors, followed by a seed company based a few miles down the road, and an international organisation with contacts to the ends of the earth. If there was minor confusion of history, with a steam loco pulling a Viking ship, no one really worried. The British love of bad puns was well catered for, as was an ongoing fascination with transport. Very few parades have not had a train in there somewhere. A swan-powered boat is a little more unusual, and an aircraft is relatively rare, especially one towing a kangaroo. Spalding had its scooter-borne mods, and the local young farmers have been in every parade since they started. One local school, the Glede Boys' School, decided that the following year's parade needed something from them. A car that would probably sell now to a collector was being turned into a steamship, complete with deckhouse and funnel topped with an appropriately flamboyant crown. A little extra assistance from a teacher was needed for the straw matting cover, but the application was in the hands of the boys. That's known as really getting inside your job. Let's hope he gets out again before the needle starts to be used. As the vessel took shape, a little final trimming needed to be done, with the garden shears, before the final application of a coat of many colours, courtesy of the farmers of South Holland, not a pharaoh in ancient Egypt. The crew take their positions. The one with the telescope is looking for an albatross. The last details are added to the float, and the SS Gledian joins the 1963 parade. That's the Glebe Boys' School, not a tribute to the author of Pygmalion. Obviously a breezy day in Spalding, but then it often is in early May. The regulars are here again, a drop of stout being very good for you. A fine set of percherons with the potatoes. Vegetable seeds for the national market. And here come the boys again. They haven't actually got a sign saying all our own work, but the pride is obviously there. As the 64 parade heads into a residential part of Spalding, remember that this is a small town. Fewer than 15,000 people at the start of the 60s, staging an event that brought in tens and even hundreds of thousands of people, but which could be watched, free of charge, from your bedroom window or the pavement outside your home. That breeze is still causing difficulties. Not that he seems to mind, but it could be the elephant that he's taking a photo of. You'll never get a toot out of that if you keep laughing, my dear. You get a good portion of fish with your chips in Spalding. By the middle 1960s, the parade was attracting large crowds to Spalding, but there was no major centre in or near the town to promote the bulb and flower industries. In 1964, work began to try to solve the problem. A site was acquired for a purpose-built exhibition centre to be located just to the east of the town. And surveyors moved in to lay out what was to become the Springfield Gardens. The job was due to take 2 years, and the first construction task was the major engineering involved in levelling the site for landscaping, drains and roadways. Trees had to be planted early in the process to give them time to establish before the gardens opened. Despite all the activity at Springfields, on the streets the show had to go on. The 1965 parade assembled on the Sir Halley Stewart Field near the Bulb Auction Rooms in Spalding. Animals seem to have featured strongly that year. I think that's a sheep. That's certainly a pig. And those are seahorses, with Neptune mounting his saddle just a little carefully. By the look of what the crowds are wearing, the weather should suit him very well. The local WI was among many organisations to celebrate anniversaries of their own within the parade. The Queen in her tulip throne, and another group well prepared with their own boat, just in case the rain should come down more heavily. The sun must be shining. The boys and girls have come out to play. Well, perhaps not. Those umbrellas do look functional rather than decorative. Back at Springfields, work went on. The trees are getting established with the help of a little mechanical weeding. Paths are being laid to link the various areas, with pergolas along some for plants to climb in later years. Concrete foundations had to be cast, and the lake base lined to guard against leakage. The exhibition hall was going up, and the offices looked as if they could soon be ready for occupation. Plants are filling the greenhouses. A flagpole going in, one of many, and the place has a name that anyone can read. The bands rolled in for the 1966 parade. The Queen took her place on the float, and this year it was the farm workers who were celebrating an anniversary, 60 years of labour organisation on the land. Local butcher George Adams, another regular supporter of the parade. Obviously a case of send in the clowns. Surely they should be playing the Banana Boat song? I've heard of a rocket ship and rocket man, but never a rocket pig before. Obviously a high flyer. That looks like a tight squeeze. The perfect marriage, fish and chips. But before the 1966 parade took to the road, there was a major question to answer. Would Springfields open in time for the flower season? The weather had been awful, and it was touch and go. But despite the problems, the gardens did open on time. As you can see from the shadows, the weather cooperated at last, and blessed the weeks before the parade with brilliant sunshine. With Springfields up and running, the bulb industry concentrated once again on the parades, which grew even more spectacular. How about a crimson tortoise? No, make that a family of crimson tortoises. Throw in a bit of World Cup celebration. After all, England took the trophy the previous year. No penalty shootouts then. The Egyptians had taken years to build the Sphinx and the temples. Spalding provided 2 of each in a matter of weeks. The confidence grew to such an extent that a film was commissioned in 1968, with the very well-known voice of James Robertson Justice to add the commentary.
The floats are designed each year by the Dutch artist Adrianus van Driel, who also designs for flower parades all over Europe. Once the plans are completed, various local firms undertake the work of making and decorating the individual floats. The first stage in making the float is to weld together an iron framework of the correct shape. This framework is normally built up round a tractor or similar vehicle so that the float can be self-propelled. The next stage is to pad the metal framework with straw matting. This is cut roughly to size and stitched onto the framework with string. When the straw is firmly attached, the outline is then cut accurately to shape with a very sharp knife. A day or so before the parade, the tulip heads are pinned onto the padded frames, and teams of helpers work far into the night to get the job completed in time. On a large float, there may be as many as 500,000 heads, each one pinned into place separately by hand. The parade itself is more than a mile long, and nearly 250,000 people line the 4.5-mile route. After the band, the first item is always the Tulip Queen's float. Following this, there may be as many as 30 other items, but we only have time to show you a few of them now. The one we saw being made got stuck at a corner and had to go at double speed to catch up.
James Robertson Justice obviously enjoyed the Spalding Flower Parade, as did huge numbers of visitors. At the end of the 60s, the event attracted upwards of 250,000 people from all over Britain, and the float sponsors have become more varied. Local companies and organisations were still the backbone of support for the show, but national and international groups were putting in more of an appearance. At Springfields, changes had taken place, and not just in terms of getting the latest flower varieties into the display beds. A new parade designer had taken over, Kees van Driel, son of Adrianus, who's looked after all the parades from 1969 up to the 40th anniversary event.
My father originally was invited over from Holland, where he designed the parade for the Dutch bulb industry, and the late Len van Geest came over and invited my father over here to start the parade here. And I took over when I came to live here in '69, because I moved here to live here. And I joined the Springfields team, who ran here the Springfields Gardens as well.
Kay's first parade was well received on the streets of Spalding. Not surprisingly, the parades attracted a lot of photographers and filmmakers, to whom we must be grateful. Without them, we wouldn't have had this record of the early years in Spalding. "1970 boasted what was probably the slowest Grand Prix car in existence. Some organisations were always there.
The young farmers have supported the parade from the very beginning, and I think it's a wonderful record because they have had no funds, and yet they have managed to raise enough money to build their own float and decorate it every year, and a lot of other very wealthy clubs and societies can't even manage to do that.
Bodybuilding, 1970s style. Pity it didn't work. The farmer's friend, the ladybird, with the farmer's ally, the land workers, on board. Something spectacular on the way? Yes, indeed. Geest goes into space, fueled by fruit, no doubt. "1972 was a special year. 4 centuries earlier, in 1572, the tulip, the basis for all this colour and celebration, was brought to Europe from its native Turkey. So the theme for the 1972 parade was Turkey and the tulip. The Turkish ambassador at the court of St. James made a special visit to Springfields. There he was presented with a basket of flowers, probably not tulips. Sending tulips to Turkey would be like coals to Newcastle. In return, he unveiled a piece of sculpture to celebrate the links between the two tulip territories. As Mr. Kunneralp left at the end of the ceremony, the locals gathered for a closer look at the statue. The verdict? Not entirely convinced. But Tulipan was at the front of that year's parade. Following close behind, the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, the Blue Mosque, linked by a giant tulip bulb with Big Ben. Still in Istanbul, the great church, mosque and museum of Hagia Sophia. The camels? Well, vaguely in the right sort of cultural territory, but beyond that, the links get more tenuous. The connections between Turkey and the magic roundabout are not at all obvious. Although, if you always suspected that Dougal's friend Dylan the rabbit was into hallucinogenic substances, it's just possible that there might be a hookah, a hubble-bubble pipe, hidden away on the float somewhere. If there was, the local police were hot on the trail. The following year was Disney year, when the streets of Spalding were filled with characters from the cartoons and films produced by the famous American studio. Donald Duck and his nephews, up to mischief no doubt, were followed by Bambi and friends. That famous bear of very little brain looks rather worried. Perhaps someone's forgotten to bring the honey. Let's hope the locals and the visitors kept off the beer that year. A purple flying elephant might persuade some of them to give up the drink forever. Snow White and a full complement of dwarves. Yes, they're all there. Grumpy, sleepy, happy, bashful, dopey, sneezy and Doc. Followed by another of the regular participants in the Spalding Parade. The local vintage cycle group rolling by on some remarkable machines. And bringing up the rear of the 73 parade, Tufty, promoting the Green Cross Code. Even at parade speeds, road safety is still important. Nearly 10 years after building started, Springfields was well established by the early 70s. The trees had grown up round the edges, the flower beds and the lake are well established, and the glasshouses offer a reliable display of colour, regardless of the state of the crop in the fields or gardens, or the weather outside. Away from the official events, tulip mosaics were quite frequently found around the town. Blowing the bulb industry's trumpet, on the 1975 parade, Miss Tulipland qualifies for her own personal police escort. Her 3-horsepower golden chariot with its enthusiastically waving pages contrasts strangely with the following float. The world's first horse-drawn moon rocket. But it was British, which may explain why we haven't heard of it since. Or perhaps the builders weren't concentrating.
I remember one year somebody slipped a couple of crates of beer underneath it to keep us going in the early hours, and on one occasion somebody nipped round to the local fish and chip shop and came back with 40 portions of fish and chips to keep us going till the early hour finish. But yes, those are the sort of things that you remember.
definitely another animals year. The National Farmers Union bull, with the dogs at its heels, followed by a much more cuddly basket bull. I'm not quite convinced about the image the Midland Bank's trying to get over to the crowds. The wolf that just ate Granny and is waiting to take a crack at Little Red Riding Hood. That geese lion looks pretty fierce as well. "1977 was another special year, as the parade celebrated the Silver Jubilee of Her Majesty the Queen. The show was full of royal paraphernalia, plenty of crowns and other symbols of majesty, but the crowd was even more impressed by the sight of the Tower of London passing through the streets of Spalding. He's there to make sure that no one makes off with the regalia. And there they are, the crown jewels in all their Fenland floral glory. That bank still looks belligerent. The Oddfellows indulging in a bit of international celebration, while the young farmers just celebrate. Exactly what isn't very clear. The St John's Ambulance celebrating 2 anniversaries, adding in their own centenary to the royal 25 years. The weather obviously wasn't very kind the following year, but that had never been known to stop a parade. The link between fierce animals on the bank seems to be catching. Tigers for the TSB. Every Spalding Flower Parade works to a theme. As we've seen, it wasn't always stuck to very closely, but everyone seems to have taken to the idea of the circus. After the parade, the floats go on display for a while. but eventually they have to be broken down to the basics, ready for rebuilding. The simplest solution is fire. From the charred remains and a lot of new material, a phoenix appears ready for the next year. As the 1970s ended, the new decade brought a more settled pattern. Most of the floats are now carrying familiar names to the parade cognoscenti. The majority of them are local or national organisations with a South Lincolnshire presence. Nice to see the Midlands become gentler in its theme, though even a womble can get pretty cross if it catches you dropping litter. That's a very happy-looking dragon, but if he's been putting the beer away at that rate all morning, it's not surprising that he's cheerful. Through the 1980s, the parade marched on, despite some difficulties. The decade started with a couple of events hit by poor weather. Numbers of visitors declined as alternative attractions caught the eye of the trippers and the travel companies. Tulip growing also became a less important part of the Lincolnshire bulb industry. The area still produces more than half the world's daffodil bulbs, but a parade totally decked out in yellow just wouldn't have the same appeal as those multicoloured tulips. Money's also been a problem for the parade in recent years, with sponsorship harder to come by and costs rising.
My closest involvement was with our local village float from West Finchwick, and we built this in the evening during the winter. We covered it with straw matting, and then 2 days before the parade all our members and wives and children came out and decorated it, and we had a wonderful time seeing it go around on the Saturday afternoon. Now almost everyone who's working on this parade is a paid person. So I very much miss the loss of the volunteer spirit. They're all keen and happy, but not many volunteers.
Other changes in later years include new materials, such as these foam plastic sheets to replace the old straw mats as the basis for the flower heads, and alternative routes through Spalding, although the section across the town bridge remains a feature of the event. The old attraction of watching the parade from your window or the pavement prevents the organisers from being able to charge the watchers. Clowns with buckets do pass through the crowds, but they're collecting for charity. There never seems to be quite enough in the parade kitty for the organisers to feel fully confident. Fortunately, the problems have never yet prevented a parade taking place. And although the events of the 90s were sometimes smaller than those of earlier years, they were just as spectacular and full of fun, as we saw when the 40th parade began to be assembled, ready to hit the streets of Spalding.
We'll do the worm in pink.
Yeah, and what about the bird?
The bird wants to be done in red, white, and the bird is just down there,
yes,
isn't it?
I've got it. The tail is in yellow with yellow
well,
crepe paper.
if we do the bird in red,
and
then
white
on the breast,
and outline,
and then we'll outline it in gander.
Oh, it certainly puts Spalding on the map. It's one of the things that gets national television, national publicity. Several of the major tour companies, bus companies that is, they often have a one-day excursion, a one-day special. Okay, the tulip industry itself in the UK has declined somewhat, but again, it's still a spectacular spring parade, and I think the emphasis has probably changed from when I first remember it in the early 70s to what it is now, and it is now a spring parade. It is the joy of spring and the fact that the weather's getting warmer.
And as the 40th parade assembled in the grounds at Springfields, you only had to look around to see that they were all happily recollecting 40 floral years of the Spalding Flower Parade.